Imagine standing at the horizon of one of the richest and the most dynamic cities in the world. Skyscrapers reflect the lights like a promise of success, speed, and endless opportunity. This is Hong Kong, a place many Americans once saw as the perfect symbol of capitalism working exactly as intended. But if you look lower, much lower, the story begins to turn. Just minutes from billion-dollar financial offices, there are small metal doors so low you have to bend to enter. Behind them is not storage space. It is where people live. Rooms barely large enough to lie down, with no windows and no natural light, where life is compressed into a few square meters. In the same city where the clock never stops, hundreds of thousands of people are living inside boxes. What makes Hong Kong so unsettling is not poverty itself, but extreme contrast. On one side is a fast, safe, orderly city, wealthy to the point of near perfection. On the other is a housing pressure so intense that it forces people into choices that, elsewhere, would only be called temporary. Not because they are lazy, not because they lack willpower, but because in this system, living space has become more valuable than time itself. For American audiences, this is not just a story about a distant Asian city. It is a magnified mirror of what happens when economic growth moves faster than the protection of human life. When a city is measured by its skyline instead of the living conditions of those at the bottom, Hong Kong still runs smoothly. Trains arrive on time. Streets are safe. Money keeps flowing. But a quiet question hangs in the air: what happens when a city wins economically, yet fails to guarantee its people even the most basic space to live? And that is where the real story begins. To understand why Hong Kong operates with such deep contradictions, we need to step back and look at how this city was formed. Hong Kong did not grow like most other cities. It was built on extremely limited land, much of it made up of mountains and protected areas. From the beginning, developable land was scarce. As the population grew rapidly, especially during periods of economic boom, the pressure on living space built up like a spring being tightly compressed. For decades, the government chose a very specific development model. Land was tightly controlled and became a major source of public revenue. Selling land use rights generated enormous income, allowing the city to maintain modern infrastructure, efficient public services, and relatively low taxes. But the cost of this model was pushed into the housing market. As land became a highly attractive investment asset, housing slowly drifted away from its role as a basic human need. At the same time, Hong Kong became a magnet for global capital. Financial firms, banks, and investment funds poured in, driving high salaries at the top of society. But not everyone benefited from this wave. Income inequality widened quickly. Service workers, manual laborers, the elderly, and single mothers faced a harsh reality. Housing prices rose far faster than their incomes ever could. When buying a home moved completely out of reach, renting was not an easy solution either. Rents climbed alongside land prices, while public housing supply failed to keep up with demand. Waiting lists stretched on for years. For many people, waiting meant living in temporary conditions for an indefinite period. It was inside this gap that extreme forms of housing began to appear, and slowly became normalized. Tiny rooms, spaces divided by thin wooden boards, and stacked bunk beds did not emerge by accident. They are the product of a system trying to extract maximum value from every square meter. Landlords subdivide space to increase profit. Tenants accept cramped conditions in exchange for proximity to work. A compromise forms, where both sides know the solution is far from ideal, yet see it as the only workable option in a market that shows little mercy. What makes this even more striking is that Hong Kong does not lack tall buildings. The city has one of the highest vertical densities in the world. But height does not equal living space. Many towers are optimized for offices and commercial use, while housing for low-income residents is pushed into the smallest corners of the system. The paradox becomes clear: a city that can rise into the sky, yet struggles to make room for the people living inside it. For American audiences, this part of the story feels familiar. Hong Kong looks like a fast-forward version of what is happening in many major cities, when housing becomes a vehicle for wealth accumulation. when investment overtakes basic living needs, and when markets are expected to self-correct, but instead push the most vulnerable to the margins. What sets Hong Kong apart is the intensity of concentration. All pressures are compressed into a small physical space, making the consequences impossible to ignore. There are no vast suburbs to absorb overflow, no empty land to delay hard choices. Every decision about land and housing leaves an immediate mark on daily life. This part of the story is not about blaming a single group. It shows how choices that seem rational in the short term can accumulate into major problems over time. The same model that made Hong Kong wealthy and efficient is also the model that turned living space into a luxury. When both realities exist side by side, conflict is no longer a possibility, it becomes inevitable, and from that foundation, the harshest slices of daily life begin to emerge, not as a sudden collapse, but as the natural outcome of a system that runs smoothly in economic terms, while growing increasingly tense on a human level. The next part of the story looks closely at everyday life in this city, where remarkable efficiency and relentless pressure intersect in every train ride, every work shift, and every square meter of space. If the previous part explained why living space in Hong Kong has been compressed to extreme levels, this part shows how the city actually functions when millions of people must adapt to that pressure every single day. This is a place where efficiency and tension exist side by side, where every movement is optimized, and the cost is felt in the smallest, most ordinary moments of life. Hong Kong wakes up early. From cramped apartments, streams of people pour into the streets with almost perfect order. The subway runs so precisely on time that it has become the standard. Every train ride is a silent lesson in discipline. No pushing, no loud voices. The city moves like a perfectly oiled machine, where every minute has economic value. For many, this is a source of pride. But for those living in tiny spaces, this rhythm also means there is no room for mistakes or for rest. A micro-apartment is not just a place to sleep. It shapes how people think and exist. When two people cannot stand upright in the same room, the idea of privacy becomes blurred. When the kitchen, the bed, and the bathroom almost merge into one, the boundary between living and resting disappears. Many people spend most of their time outside not because they love the city's energy, but because inside, there is barely space to breathe. This explains why public space matters so much in Hong Kong. Cafes, libraries, shopping malls, even subway stations become temporary shelters. The city unintentionally expands living space by pushing people outward. But public space is not always free or easy to access. For low-income residents, every cup of coffee or meal outside becomes a calculation. Staying longer means spending more. For women, this pressure takes on a specific form. Many work in service, retail, or care jobs, with wages that cannot keep up with rent. Cramped living conditions increase risks to safety and mental health. Some work overtime, night shifts, or take informal side jobs just to maintain a basic standard of living. Not because they seek a risky lifestyle, but because the system forces them to survive within very narrow limits. Hong Kong remains one of the safest large cities in the world, something many other global cities envy. But safety does not mean comfort. Surveillance, discipline, and pressure to succeed create an environment where emotions are rarely shown. Exhaustion hides behind calm faces. Stories of strain rarely spill onto the streets, but they quietly build up behind closed doors. Another paradox appears at night. When the sun goes down, Hong Kong does not slow down. Lan Kwai Fong and entertainment districts light up, drawing young people, office workers, and tourists. For many, nightlife is the only release from daytime pressure. Yet the contrast is striking. The places where money is spent fastest are often just a few subway stops away from the tightest living spaces. On one side, lights and music. On the other, dark, silent rooms. For American audiences, this part of the story feels both foreign and familiar. Foreign in the extreme compression of space and urban discipline. Familiar in the pressure to succeed, rising living costs, and growing mental fatigue that are spreading across major cities everywhere. Hong Kong feels like a social laboratory, where these trends are pushed to their limits. What is striking is that many people in Hong Kong do not see their lives as tragic. They take pride in resilience and adaptability. But endurance is not the same as health. When a city runs so smoothly that it leaves no room for people to slow down, the question is no longer how efficient it is, but how long it can last. This part of the story shows that a crisis does not have to be loud. It can exist in silence, in on-time trains, in always locked rooms, and in people who learn to live smaller than they ever thought possible. And from that silence, larger questions begin to form about the true cost of a city often held up as a model of economic success. If the earlier parts showed how smoothly Hong Kong operates and the human cost behind that efficiency, this part goes straight to the system's breaking point. This is where theories about markets, efficiency, and adaptation collide directly with real life, where housing, a foundation of stability, is distorted to its most extreme form. The spaces known as coffin homes or cage homes do not appear in official plans. They exist inside aging buildings and deteriorating neighborhoods, where apartments are cut into narrow compartments with wooden or metal partitions. Each compartment is just large enough for a bed, sometimes too low to stand upright, with no windows and almost no ventilation. Light comes from a fluorescent bulb hanging close to the ceiling, switched on as a poor substitute for the sun. What makes these spaces haunting is not only their size, but the fact that they have become normalized. Tenants know their living conditions fall far below any standard, but real alternatives barely exist. Rent still consumes a large share of monthly income, even though the space measures only a few square meters. For many elderly people, low-income workers, and single women, this is not a temporary stop. It is a long-term reality lasting years. A day inside these spaces is organized around forced minimalism. Every item must be stacked or hung on the wall. Changing clothes, resting, and cooking all happen in the same tiny area. Sounds from neighboring compartments pass easily through thin walls, making privacy almost disappear. At night, heat and humidity rise, creating a constant sense of suffocation that directly affects physical and mental health. Safety risks are always present. Tangled electrical wires, overloaded outlets, emergency exits narrowed by makeshift partitions. A small incident can quickly turn into disaster. Fires in these buildings have happened before, leaving lasting fear, but that fear fades quickly as the city's pace sweeps everything forward again. What matters most is that these extreme living spaces are not outside the system. They exist at its core. They survive because real demand exists and because the market allows them to exist. Landlords maximize profit per square meter. Tenants minimize expectations just to stay close to work. A compromise forms, trapping both sides in an economic logic that satisfies no one. For women, especially those working night shifts or unstable jobs, the pressure is even heavier. Cramped living conditions increase vulnerability. Sharing bathrooms, kitchens, and hallways with strangers creates constant stress. Some are forced to seek extra income on the margins, not to improve their lives, but simply to remain in the city. This is where questions of social responsibility can no longer be avoided. Hong Kong has resources, management capacity, and a history of building massive infrastructure projects. Yet when it comes to housing the most vulnerable, progress always lags behind reality. Public housing programs exist, but waiting lists stretch so long that they lose meaning for people living in urgent conditions. For American audiences, this part of the story may feel uncomfortably familiar, not because they live in similar spaces, but because the logic behind them is recognizable. When housing becomes an investment asset, when markets are expected to solve everything, and when public solutions arrive too late, extreme forms of living emerge as a predictable result. Hong Kong's breaking point is not chaotic collapse, but quiet acceptance. A society can keep functioning, even thriving economically, while part of its population lives in conditions that elsewhere would be called an emergency. That silence is the most troubling part. When boxes become homes and a few square meters become the new normal, the question is no longer whether the system is efficient, but who it truly serves. This part of the story is not meant to shock with images, but with recognition. A housing crisis does not need to explode to exist. It can quietly sink in, room by room, person by person, until an entire city adjusts to a lower standard of living without ever officially admitting that something has failed. Once the breaking point is exposed, the story cannot stop at description or emotion. This part places Hong Kong in front of hard choices, where every path carries a cost, and no solution is complete. This is the moment the city must face its most fundamental question: does a modern city exist to maximize economic efficiency, or to guarantee a minimum standard of living for everyone who keeps it running? The first option is to continue relying on market logic, with only modest adjustments. This approach assumes that if housing supply increases, prices will eventually cool. Many redevelopment and land expansion projects have been proposed, but in reality, these projects take years to complete, while urgent needs unfold every day. As long as land prices and profit remain the main drivers, new housing tends to target higher-income buyers. Low-income residents remain on the sidelines, or benefit only indirectly, and very slowly. The second option is to expand social housing and accept stronger government intervention. That means changing how resources are allocated, reducing dependence on land revenue, and confronting resistance from interest groups accustomed to the current order. Large-scale public housing projects could improve living conditions for hundreds of thousands of people, but they also raise challenges around budgets, planning, and social consensus. In a city where efficiency is treated as a core value, prioritizing welfare can be seen as slow or costly. Between these two paths lies a range of middle ground solutions: upgrading old buildings to meet basic safety standards, limiting or banning the subdivision of apartments below a certain size, increasing rental assistance for vulnerable groups. Each measure makes sense on its own, but taken separately, they only relieve pressure without addressing the root problem. Implemented together, they demand a high level of coordination and political will. What makes the challenge even harder is time. People living in cramped spaces cannot wait another decade for the market to adjust for them. Each passing month means continued harm to physical and mental health. When policy arrives too late, it loses meaning for those who need it most. For American audiences, this part of the story sounds like a familiar warning. Many major cities face similar choices, differing mainly in degree. As housing becomes a global investment asset, cities compete for capital, and local residents are pushed into weaker positions. Hong Kong is not an exception, it is an extreme example. Another question emerges: can a city still call itself successful if its success rests on the quiet sacrifice of part of its population? When the people who clean, serve, care for, and operate the city cannot afford to live in it, the development model reveals a deep internal contradiction. Economic efficiency achieved by compressing human lives to their limit is unlikely to be sustainable. This part offers no final answer, because there is no simple one. It shows that every choice involves trade-offs, and that avoiding a choice is itself a choice. When a city delays, the system adjusts on its own in the harshest way possible, through boxes, makeshift partitions, and steadily lowered living standards. Hong Kong now stands at a crossroads between preserving a model that delivered prosperity and accepting change to protect basic human dignity. Both paths are difficult, but one thing is clear: without a decisive choice, the city will continue drifting on inertia, where wealth and deprivation coexist without shock, leaving only a dangerous sense of normality. This section closes with a crucial realization: the housing crisis is not the failure of a single policy, but the result of many choices accumulated over time. And when those choices are not honestly re-examined, the cost is not just a few square meters of space, it is the belief that a city can be both prosperous and fair. As the story reaches its end, Hong Kong is no longer seen as a specific place, but as a mirror reflecting the choices modern cities are already making, and will soon be forced to confront. What makes Hong Kong worth thinking about is not its wealth or operational efficiency, but the way it pushes people to adapt to a shrinking standard of living while still calling the condition normal. Hong Kong reveals an uncomfortable truth. a city can reach the highest levels of order, safety, and economic growth, while at the same time failing to guarantee every resident enough living space to preserve basic dignity. This failure is not loud. It does not collapse the system. It happens quietly, one subdivided room at a time. 1 year spent waiting for public housing. 1 generation learning to accept less than what their parents once considered the bare minimum. For American audiences, this story carries meaning far beyond Asia. Similar pressures are emerging in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and many other cities. Housing prices rise faster than incomes. Living space shrinks. Essential workers find it harder to remain in the very cities they keep running. Hong Kong is not an exception. It is an early warning of what happens when these trends are pushed to their limit. The most troubling issue is not the existence of coffin homes, but their normalization. When society begins to accept a few square meters as enough, living standards quietly fall. When adaptation is praised as strength, it becomes easy to forget that adaptation can also mean having no real alternatives. And when this lasts long enough, questions of fairness slowly disappear from policy discussions. Hong Kong also raises a deeper moral question: who does a city truly serve? Investors, markets, and global capital, or the people who operate it every day? When the answer leans too far in one direction, the system may still look efficient on paper, but it starts to lose legitimacy in real life. This ending does not call for a single solution, because every city has its own limits and context, but it insists on one essential point: housing cannot be treated only as a commodity. When living space becomes an auction, the losers do not vanish. They are pushed into tighter, less visible corners, until their existence becomes an uncomfortable detail society learns to ignore. Hong Kong shows that economic growth, when not matched with strong social protection, can produce a very different kind of instability. Not violence, but the slow erosion of trust. Trust that hard work leads to a stable life. Trust that a city's success is also the success of its people. When that trust fades, the cost is not just dissatisfaction, but a growing distance between people and the place they call home. The final question Hong Kong leaves behind is not why the city became this way, but whether other cities are willing to learn from it. Will they act while change is still possible, or only look back once the boxes have become the new standard of living? And can a city truly be called successful if its prosperity requires so many people to live quietly, cramped, and with less than they deserve? Ending here, Hong Kong is no longer just a story about living space. It is a story about choices, about values, and about how society decides to measure success. When those choices are repeated long enough, they do not only shape a city, they shape how people understand dignity, fairness, and the future they are building together.